Holt Hanley here with Zeke Lunder. Before we get started, I just want to thank you. You've been a great help to me. Been watching your videos for quite some time now. Lots of great information on management, fuels, all the different perspectives that I wouldn't get anywhere else. So first, just want to thank you. And then just want to toss it over to you if you want to do like a quick introduction.
All right. Yeah, my name's Zeke Lunder. I run a website called The Lookout and a YouTube channel called Lookout. I'm on Twitter as Wildland Zico. And I've been working in wildland fire and prescribed fire for about 25 years. I'm a geographer by training. I started a company to do mapping of large wildfires. Before that, I did the same stuff. So I've been kind of working in fire intelligence and wildfire mapping since about 1999. And I live in Chico, California.
Nice. Yeah, one of the big reasons I wanted to talk to you today was because of those decades of experience. So we were just talking about this before we started recording, but I think I'll throw that question back to you is, what are the biggest changes that you've seen in the last few decades when it comes to wildfire and just also in the management aspect as well?
Well, yeah, as a map maker, I think one of the big changes is like when I started, fires always fit on the same size of paper. You know, we'd do like a 3x4 foot briefing map at 24,000 scale, and the fires just fit on there. Like you didn't have to make a bigger map. You didn't have to change the scale. Like you go out and the fire was like 30,000 acres, maybe it was a really big fire. And now when we go out on fires, like you'll end up having like 5 or 6 maps just to cover at the same scale, the same thing. So just in one, in a real practical sense, like we buy a lot more paper in the map shop than we did because the fires are just, landscape scale. When I started my career, we didn't have VLAT, very large air tankers that dropped, 10,000 gallons. We didn't have real-time infrared mapping, and like we didn't need it. And so I guess my perspective is that like we've had these huge technical kind of innovations in the way we respond to fires. And even so, like even with all the best technology and everything we can throw at them, like they're just getting bigger and bigger. So that's the biggest change I've seen. Is just like we've geared up big time. We can drop, thousands of gallons of mud on a fire from the get-go, and they're still kind of just doing what they want once they get established.
So it's almost like our responses to fire have gotten much, much more advanced, but the fires are still getting larger and larger.
Yeah. Fire doesn't really care about any of that,
Yeah.
Like it's not listening to what we have to say about it.
What would you say is the reason that we're almost kind of losing this race with wildfire right now?
Right. Yeah, I don't think it's kind of, I think we lost.
Yeah.
We win a lot of little battles. Firefighters do a lot of great work, but like when it comes to like the Dixie Fire, Colder Fire, these fires burn until they hit the desert, or they run out of fuel, or it rains. But I think, the big reasons, there's a few of them that are all coming together. It's not just climate change. It's just, it's not just people moving into the brush. It's not just, retention of firefighters. It's all these things that are coming together at once. We're got a hotter, drier climate, more people living in the brush, got a longer season because it gets hotter earlier in the year and it doesn't rain till later in the fall. You've got people that are really burnt out from dealing with the last, 5 of the 6 largest fires in California history in the last 5 years. You've got COVID that's kind of really taken away a lot of the inmate firefighting crews. So just everything coming together in a kind of perfect storm, and fires kind of benefiting from all of these things.
Yeah, that's definitely a lot of factors. I think that was like the one thing that I've focused most on in my master's thesis was I never like when there's like one simple explanation for like a very complex problem. So like in my thesis, I was trying to rank order using machine learning, like all the different factors that were playing into it. So you could actually kind of see what the relative importance of different things was.
Yeah.
Because with big problems like this, never is just like one simple solution.
Right. Yeah, and I think one thing that I've been seeing a lot is just that even though we're having some really big fires, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the worst thing that could happen. You know, I think the biggest problem we've got in forestry and kind of land management is just that the scale of managing the, you know, millions of acres of forest that we have in California is like it far exceeds our ability and the economy and the workforce and everything else. And so fires kind of ending up doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And it isn't always the worst thing that could happen. You know, this fire, the Washburn fire that just burned, like time will tell, but you know, it may be that the forest is healthier after the fire than it would have been if we hadn't had a fire there for another 20 years.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up the Washburn Fire. That was one of the main things that I wanted to talk with you about. Would you almost describe that fire as almost kind of like a success story for prescribed burning?
I think we'll have to wait and see. You know, it takes a year or two sometimes to tell if the trees have died, but it's kind of, you know, we've been worried about fires in these areas that had a lot of beetle kill, you know, 8 to 10 years ago. We saw just millions of trees die in the Sierra, obviously, over the last 10 years. And it's been kind of an open question of how that fire hazard's going to change over the next, you know, 10, 20, 30 years. So seeing fire burn in this ecosystem, there's a lot for us to learn about it. We may see that the fire, that a lot of the big trees survived, but one of the open questions right now is just with so much dead and down material and what we call the residence time of heat that happened there from the fire burning slowly for days. You know, there's worries that we've cooked a lot of the roots of the trees or that the radiant heat may have cooked the cambium layer. So even though trees may look green right now, a lot of people are going to be watching closely to see how many of those trees die in the next year or two.
For the most part, though, didn't the fire like curve around most of the giant sequoias in there?
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of ran up parallel to the grove and then it backed down the mountain and kind of moved sideways up the canyon.
So do you think that was mostly because of what they were doing like in real time to stop that fire? Or was that a combination of what they're doing in real time and the prescribed burning that they've done over the last couple decades that I heard you talking about in one of your videos?
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of it was the weather and where the fire started. And
Mhm.
so the fire, you know, the prescribed fire that they did, it may have been somewhat immaterial in actually keeping the fire out of the grove. It helped them fight the fire on that flank, but often we pick up fires on their flanks. You know, fire runs up the hill, the tankers usually aren't effective at the head and they want to use them somewhere. So they start on the flanks that where the fire's kind of backing, or they start at the heel. So it may just be that the grove survived because the fire started in the right place and the fire didn't really run straight at the grove. The fire kind of ran obliquely up the hill. So, I mean, it didn't hurt that they had a bunch of prescribed fire done and it made it easier for the hotshot crews that cut the line there. But it's not necessarily that the fire was running straight at the grove and then it saw the prescribed fire and turned and ran away.
Gotcha. Yeah, because I've seen that on some maps in the past. I think I remember this on the Tamarack fire, especially where a lot of times it'll push up right to like a burn scar and then just stop almost like a puzzle piece. And
Yeah.
I imagine part of that's because the fuel's been cleared out, but maybe sometimes they're able to reuse containment lines or that kind of stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
But
that happened on the Caldor fire and it happened on the Dixie fire. Like previous fire scars always are a good thing when you're trying to manage a landscape scale fire.
yeah, so you wouldn't exactly say that that was like the crucial aspect that saved the giant sequoias in this one.
It didn't hurt having it,
Yeah.
but you know, there's good data out there to kind of, if you wanted to dig in and kind of reconstruct that. One of the cool things that's happening right now is all this daytime infrared, you know, the FIRIS program, the Firewatch program, really last year on the Dixie was one of the first years that we just had a real amazing amount of daytime infrared intel being flown. In the past, like when I first started doing fire mapping, they would fly over in a plane in the middle of the night and they would print like this fax paper kind of black and white scan of the fire, and they'd roll it up in a tube, a little plastic tube, and they'd have a little flashing light and a beeper in there. And they'd come and they had a hole in the floor of the plane, and they'd do a touch and go at the nearest airport, and they'd drop the tube out the hole in the floor. And then the infrared interpreter would run out there and find the tube in the dark. Sometimes they'd have a bike so they could like ride out, on the runway. And this is like 2 or 3 in the morning, and then they'd come back to the map shop and they would kind of eyeball this black and white kind of drawing or funky print onto a topo map, and then that was our perimeter for the next day for our mapping. Now it's like they fly this perimeter, it's downloaded immediately from the plane to a server, and you can jump on a website, an intel website at the National Fire Center, and you can see the perimeter like 5 minutes later. So when we talk about kind of reconstructing things like the first day of the fire, the second day, it's like all of a sudden I can have 3 or 4 perimeters from the 8 hours of the burning period. So it's really great stuff now.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable just to see how far it's come. And like, I mean, I haven't been doing this all that long, but I feel like in the first year I started following wildfires to now, it's much, much easier to actually figure out where the fire is. And
Yeah,
like
and you got a
where
camera on every mountain, and you got 30 people on Twitter listening to the scanner traffic. So yeah, it's pretty amazing time to be a fly on the wall with wildfire.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think about earlier you said we've sort of, or not sort of, but we have lost the, what could you call it, the war with wildfire or something. But would you say that there are things shifting now where we could start to turn the tide?
To
Or
win
if
it,
or if not, are there things that we could do to just kind of live with fire in the future instead of having it be kind of like this war dynamic?
yeah. Well, I think we need to negotiate a truce, right? Like we like to use this war metaphor of like war and wildfire, and it's not about beating wildfire. Um, I think when I say that we're losing the war, that we've lost the war on wildfire, it's just that it's like this insurgency where like everything we do in firefighting makes the enemy stronger. If fire is the enemy, like we just give it more fuel. We just postpone that day, and then so like the air tankers, the very large air tankers are great. They're super effective. If you've got like 3 large air tankers, you can put out a fire in really extreme conditions. And but I don't know that that's a win because say Santa Rosa or Berry Creek or these places that have gotten devastated by these big east wind fires, they come at night when we can't fly tankers, and they come when it's windy and the fire spotting. And so even though we're just kind of postponing it, like air tankers are going to save a lot of these foothill towns over and over and over, and then they're not. Like, and in the meantime, we just build up this huge deficit of fire and crazy fuel loads, and we help people feel like somehow that they're safe because every time there's a fire, we put it out. I don't think that we can't keep that up forever. So when I say we've lost the war, it's just that we have to think kind of like in longer term than like, hey, we put out every fire today. We put out every fire yesterday. So I think there's a lot we can do to come into better relation with it. And a part of that is kind of ceding some control, right? Like when you negotiate a truce, like you give up some territory, right? Like fire needs something from us if we're going to have a truce. It's not going to just like, we're not going to say, okay, we're not going to have a ceasefire, right? Because fire is going to keep coming. So, I mean, that's part of, I think, this talk about like, climate adaptation, and like retreat is one climate adaptation. Like maybe you don't build, if sea level's rising, maybe you don't build a new, mall right down by the waterfront. And so maybe we retreat from some of these areas that are just really gnarly for fire. But there has to be some kind of give and take there. So I think coming into better relation with fire means that Right now we're paralyzed about using prescribed burning because the fuels are so bad in some of these areas that we have to burn in summertime conditions to really reduce them. We can go burn pine needles in the fall and winter, but we're not like really affecting major changes in like the brush. Maybe the only time we can burn and accomplish that is in July or August during a wildfire. So when we talk about scaling up wildfire, it's like that might mean that we're burning in July and August, or that we're letting fires burn out to, like one thing I've been thinking about a lot, we've been doing prescribed burning in the foothills here. And what I think about with like the Calf Canyon fire, Hermit's Peak fire in New Mexico is that what those fires show you is that you can't just go put fire on the ground in the middle of a, 500,000 acre area that all has fire hazard problems, or really bad things can happen. But like when we're putting fire on the ground in Forest Ranch, we put fire on the ground in the safest place we can find. And then the next time we put fire on the ground, we put it on the ground downhill of that place we just burned. And slowly we kind of build this, what we'd call an anchor point or kind of a toehold in the landscape. And I see that we could do the same thing with prescribed burning. Like, if we work with ranchers around Chico right now, the fire department's doing big burns, burned 180 acres a couple weeks ago at the airport. Then when we have a wildfire, we've got black on the ground. And so if we wanted to burn, 100,000 acres in the Coast Range, we could go out in the spring and do grassland burns for a quarter mile off of a major road, help out the rancher with forage. And then if there's a fire burning in the backcountry, let it burn to there. We can contain fires in the spring just by strategically putting fire on the ground. But we're not going to get to 1 million acres a year of prescribed burning, which is what the state says they want to do, without using wildfire or burning in season. But these are things that we can do to get in better relation with wildfire. In some of these communities that are really at risk, we can use prescribed fire, but we're still going to have to, we're going to have to give up things. We're going to have to, maybe that trailer park that's on the ridge, on the strategic ridge, maybe that needs to be bought out and relocated. I mean, when you look at the cost of, so we had they all run together, but we had the windy fire, the winding fire this week, burned 100 acres. Like we probably spent at least $1 million on aviation in 3 or 4 hours on that fire. It burned 3 homes. So basically we could have bought those 3 homes, right? Just for the cost of aviation. And so when we've got a fire and we spend $5 million to protect property that's worth $3 million, like what are the taxpayers getting from that?
And would you say it's almost, would we get like more bang for our buck if we were to use those same resources for prescribed burning, clear out a lot of the fuels, and then you have smaller fires down the line versus putting out fires as fast as possible, the fuels build up, and then you have a giant fire which costs just a massive amount of money?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so sticky, like we've got this language that, we've over the years the Forest Service has talked about prescribed natural fire or wildland fire use or adaptive fire management. And the term keeps changing, but the concept originally was like, hey, we're going to let fires that are doing good work keep doing that work. And in California, that's become untenable just because we see things like the Bear Fire that burns for months, does a lot of good work. And then in September, we get a big east wind and it runs 35 miles, burns 100,000 acres in a day, kills 15 people, burns down the whole town. And so the Tamarack Fire, all these things that started off as like, hey, we're going to let these fires burn for resource benefit. Like people don't forget that. Fire managers who made the decision to let those fires burn don't forget that. And so we're kind of in a position where no one really wants to let fires burn for resource benefit in the state of California. But we don't have a choice because at some point when we've got a lot of fire on the ground, we have to triage. The reason that the Bear Fire got managed for resource benefit was because we didn't have enough crews, because we had 1,000 lightning starts and there's fires burning in Calistoga and there's fires burning in Carmel Valley. And so, yeah, you're going to let the fire 20 miles from a town burn because you're not going to burn down Carmel Valley. You're not going to burn down Calistoga. So we kind of don't have a choice in this. Whenever we have a big lightning bust, we triage, and we're going to let fires burn that aren't going to burn down a senator's house or burn down, a mansion on TV.
Do you think it's almost kind of like we have to weigh the risk of not letting fire happen against the risk of like the big fires happening? Like, obviously, when a huge fire is burning, people will see that as a big risk.
Mm-hmm.
But then, isn't there also a risk to not doing intentional burning to
I
clear
think
out
that's
some of the fuels ahead of?
I think this is a great point. Especially with prescribed fire, everyone's worried with prescribed fire about the risk of escape, and we've got Collins Pine Company around where I lived in Chester, and they manage about 100,000 acres of forest land, and they've got a reputation for, they were one of the companies that had the best reputation. They were one of the first big companies in California to get certified under the Forest Stewardship Council sustainability certification. And so we've, taken people out to the Collins Pine Forest for years to show them like what good sustainable forestry looks like. And I've talked to their last 3 general managers over the last 20 years and said, you guys got to put fire on the ground. And they're like, oh, it's too much liability. The owners don't want to do it. And I said, you're not going to have a forest to manage if you don't put fire on the ground. Too much liability. Next person comes, same thing. Family is not interested. The Dixie Fire burned 50,000 acres of Collins Forest in just under like 3 days, just to a crisp. And they might not have a company anymore. There's been a mill in Chester for 100 years, and they might not survive. So I think it's a great time to ask that question. What was the risk of not doing it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can afford to not use fire. It's the only tool that really pencils out when you look at how much it costs to thin, and a lot of the land that we have, we can't log anyway because it's too steep, too inaccessible, or there's no market for the timber.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was kind of reminds me of something that I really liked learning about when I was researching the Washburn Fire, was all like the natural adaptations that giant sequoias have. Their seeds are in cones that can lay dormant for like 20 years until a fire comes through, clears out all the competing vegetation, like germinates the seed or pops open the cone. And then it has like the extremely thick bark that's has the fire resistant tannin, then it has the self pruning, so all the lower branches fall off so that it's safer, it protects its canopy if there's like a ground fire. But then we often think of like the giant sequoias being threatened by fire. But it was actually I believe it was this book that I was reading, David Carley, Introduction to Fire in California. And he said, it's not exactly fire that's threatening the giant sequoias, but fire exclusion. Yeah. Because they have all these natural adaptations that has been protecting them from fire for 2,000 years.
Right.
But what's actually dangerous is when you don't have fire, and then the fuels build up enough where a fire that comes through could get into the canopy, or it just burns so hot that it overwhelms
it's a huge messaging problem. Everyone's upset because the fires in 2020 burned, 15% of the giant sequoia that are left. And then it becomes a climate change story, and everyone says climate change is threatening these. But when you look at where the trees are that did get killed, they were in these thickets of white fir and cedar, of like pretty good sized trees that are as old as fire suppression. And those same kind of shade tolerant species, when they're little, they get killed by fire. When we burn through white fir, it's like you can just hear this little like all over the place of these things going up in these like cool little Roman candles. And to me, like watching the TV and seeing like the main story in the New York Times and Washington Post is these guys out wrapping tinfoil around these trees that are fire adapted. Like what a crazy kind of PR stunt. Like the trees don't need tinfoil. The trees need logging right? And but especially the places they're wrapping these trees, like they weren't even threatened because they were like thinned and burned and in these parks surrounded by trails and everything. So just like, man, who is calling the shots at the Park Service? They're like, oh, get out the tinfoil, bring the TV cameras. It's like, can't you get them out at some other time? Show us burning. Like, it just, to me, it hurt me every time I saw a picture of like a big giant sequoia wrapped in tinfoil. It just like dagger in my heart of like, how come no one is telling the story about like how stupid this is to be wrapping sequoia trees in tinfoil? Like, I couldn't stand it.
Yeah, I was actually wondering how that worked because I read the thing about the fire resistant bark. And then is the reasoning like if there were fuels built up that it would create so much heat that it would overwhelm the fire resistant bark? Or is it
Well, I think they're worried about, the fire can go up the trees, up the bark and burn, and it can cause damage. But those trees have a lot of character from
mhm.
previous fire scars, and from like getting half eaten away by fire. And so I don't know. I got to say, I'm not a giant sequoia expert. I'm a Northern Sierra kid and we don't have
Mhm.
giant sequoia. But just as, a fire communicator, I feel like the Park Service, man, they got to get some better communicators in there. Cause like even on Washburn, like, why is it that the national media ran for 3 or 4 days with like that the grove was threatened when it was really clear from the very beginning of the fire that the grove was not threatened? And it's like, why isn't the Park Service jumping on telling this story that it's not a problem?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, to me, like the coolest part of the whole story though was just kind of the idea that if we allow like a lot of these fires to happen to clear out fuels and stuff, it's actually returning California to a more natural environment. Like I imagine some people when they hear that we want to do prescribed burning or something, they're worried about the vegetation that would get burned, but isn't it actually more natural for California to have shorter intervals of burning, and like a lot of our ecosystems are actually adapted to fire like that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the thing is that fire's messy. It's not a precision tool. So even if you put fire on the ground in a prescribed burn, there's no guarantee you're not going to kill more trees than you want to kill. There's no guarantee that the wind might come up and at the wrong time. But I think when I talked earlier about like kind of seeding something to fire in this truce, is like you have to seed. We tend to think we have more control over things than we do, and so people want to think that like we're only going to do prescribed burn when the flame lengths are 4 feet tall and it only kills 32% of the trees. And it's like, well, there might be places that the fire flares up and kills 70% of the trees. But I think when you look at the bigger picture, is like some of the research we have now is telling us that we have like a lot of places 3, 4, 5 times more trees per acre than we need or than is healthy. And if I was going to go out in the woods as a forester and then a sick, overstocked forest, I would use logging machines and chainsaws, and I would cut those trees down and I would haul them to a mill and make 2x4s out of them. But I'd kill a ton of trees. That's how you thin a forest. You kill a lot of trees. But if you do it with prescribed burning and people drive by and they see a bunch of red trees that you killed a fire, they think that you screwed up. Oh man, they screwed up. They killed all those trees. It's like, well, that's what we need to do if we're gonna restore our forests. Forests have too many trees. Got to kill the trees, right? And so I think people need to accept it. Like, and sometimes that might mean that you burn more trees than you wanted to. But when we look at the entire landscape, you know, um, the Caples burn up in by Kirkwood, it was a prescribed burn that got away and became kind of a big um, black eye for the local forest for a while because it was smoky and people don't like hearing that prescribed burns out of control. But during the Caldor fire, having that scar there from Caples saved Kirkwood.
Hmm.
And so, having patches of high severity fire on the landscape comes in handy when you're trying to put out a landscape scale wildfire.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think the one thing that really helped me understand like that too many trees on the landscape thing was, I believe it was my advisor told me, or if you have an acre and just use like a random number here, and that acre is supposed to sustain 10 trees. So those trees have adapted to get that amount of water within that acre. But then if there's 100 trees, all of a sudden they're sharing the exact same amount of water that 10 trees evolved to live off of. So then each one gets weakened, and then they're more susceptible to things like pests or
Right.
disease, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
another
And
one of those
like that.
ideas where it's like we're better off actually trying to mimic the more natural ecosystem.
Yeah. I think of it kind of like blood. If you're standing in a room with 10 people and you guys are sharing the blood that it takes for 10 people to live, then you're all going to be healthy. But if you like spread that blood out among 100 people and then one person gets sick, and everyone's low, 3 pints low on blood, like you're going to have a big die off. Right. So don't see there's a lot of difference there. It's a great analogy.
And then kind of the other thing that makes me think of is I go visit my grandparents up in Montana where there's been a ton of bark beetle kill as well. And there's some parts of the forest where it's just thousands of dead pine trees. And I couldn't imagine that it'd be possible to burn there without it just turning into some gigantic fire. Is that part of the problem? Are there like so many dead trees now that we almost like can't burn them out?
I think we're going to find out, things like Washburn, we've had some big fires in the Sierra post beetle kill, and they haven't all been terrible disasters. Obviously, things like the Creek Fire were really like there's a lot of high severity fire, bad situation. But I think that kind of part of this whole thing is we're on this train that's kind of running away from us, and we're along for the ride. And so, like, we killed a lot of the trees. There's going to be a lot of trees that die in the next 100 years. Even right now, there's a lot of trees that are going to die in the next 10 years from either beetles or fire. Like, we killed those trees 100 years ago when we started putting out all the fires. And there's these it's not like tomorrow. It's all, if we suddenly like figured out forest management tomorrow, it's not like everything's just going to like turn on a dime. I think of it kind of like family dynamics, like if you've had alcoholism and abuse and poverty and strife in your family for 7 generations, and then like one person gets a degree or something, it's not like suddenly all that doesn't matter anymore and like everything's hunky-dory. Like, the seeds are sown, and our forests have taken 100 years to get in the shape they're in. So maybe these places with all this big beetle kill blowdown are going to burn hot, and they're going to turn to brush fields. But when you look at like millions of acres, like we're not going to do anything about that. And if we go out and just like think that we're going to like drone seed a bunch of trees out there into these brush fields and have a forest again, like we're shortcutting. Like, nature doesn't work that way. You have a fire, then you have brush, and then 100 years later you've got some big trees again. But like, the more we try to shortcut that process, the more likely we're just going to burn up that next group of trees that we threw into the brush field.
That's interesting. When it comes to people living in the wildland urban interface, do you know if there's any advancements we're making on like fireproof housing materials, or could people get a reasonable amount of safety just by making their own like defensible space?
It's complicated. There's good research out there. So much of it depends on the land use. So much of it depends on the layout of the community. We write kind of wildfire plans for communities, and a lot of places are just kind of set up for failure by the original lot design. Engineers and fire kind of tend to think alike. Like, engineers like to build roads that go up canyons kind of on a contour with a little bit of climb to them, and fire loves that. That's exactly how. So when you've got engineers laying out houses going up a canyon that are all right next to each other, right in a row, it's a perfect setup for the fire to do the same thing. And so in places with small lots, with old homes that don't have much separation, like in Paradise, um, all it takes is one house to catch on fire, and then the whole neighborhood's going to go if there's not active firefighting going on. And often during a Tubbs fire, a bear fire, a campfire, firefighters are just trying to save lives and evacuate people. They're not fighting the fire at all.
Mm.
So there's some places where just the DNA of the community is really flawed and makes it almost impossible to achieve resiliency, because we talk about removing fuels to reduce fire hazard, but in a lot of places the fuels are homes. You look at, Marin County, kind of that northeast side of Mount Tam, you're not going to thin homes to reduce the fuel. And so some of those places you can cut all the brush and you'd still have a problem if one house is catch on fire and then catching the next one on fire, the next one on fire. So I mean, good urban design is a really important part of this. And I think part of it is that, like, there's an enormous pressure in California to build more housing. And we need to be incorporating fire behavior into the actual subdivision design. Because maybe we can put a golf course or an open space or a mountain bike trail in that alignment where the fire wants to run instead of homes. Maybe put the homes in a place on the landscape that isn't quite as set up for failure.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Marin County, because I was part of like this wildfire clearing program where we'd rent a chipper for a day and then have like 4 dumpsters. And then people would get all their clippings, just throw it on their driveways. And then my cousins and I would just go around in our trucks, collect all their clippings and branches, and then throw it in the chipper. But as we were driving through those hills, the number one thing I noticed was, one, how narrow the roads were. Like a lot of those roads, I don't even think you could get a fire engine up. And then 2, there'd be like one road coming out for all of these different houses. And then even though there would be a fair bit of vegetation being cleared out, there would just be a ridiculous amount still left there.
Yeah.
So
I think, what I rode my bike through some of that area a couple of years ago, and right after the campfire. And I think what I've been thinking as a planner and kind of geographer is just that what we need to accept as reality that those places are going to burn down, that the northeast side of Mount Tam is going to burn down, that a lot of these towns are going to burn down. It's just going to happen. And that we need to be planning now for what we do after that. Because Paradise burned down, and then we had 10,000 vacant lots sitting there. And it would have been a perfect time to get some money together and buy 1,000 lots, combine them, and then re-subdivide in a fire resilient footprint that has a better chance of surviving the next fire. Because we know that we'll have another fire in Paradise. But instead, there was no plan, and the town government kind of defined success in the number of building permits they could issue in the shortest amount of time. And now people are rebuilding on these same lots when we know that the urban pattern is what affected house to house transmission of fire. So in a lot of these places that are the highest hazard, it's like, let's start planning now, and let's have some idea of how we could do it better if we were starting over, because we will be starting over in these places. The houses are going to burn down. We're going to scrape the lots. We're going to haul away toxic waste, and then we're going to start over. So why not start over with a better footing next time?
that kind of reminds me of a photo that I saw from Paradise. It almost looked like a lot of the trees were still green, but then all the houses were just completely wiped out and just ash. Is that due to like the building materials just being more flammable than trees somehow? Or is that due to
It was
the
it was
architectural
Jewish
design
space lasers.
that
Jewish space lasers. It
yeah,
was like,
actually, I have those
because
words like censored on my YouTube account because I was getting
Jewish space
so many
lasers.
of those comments on my videos.
Right, because California wanted to build the high-speed rail through Paradise, and so the Jewish space lasers, they use them to burn all the houses, so then the high-speed rail can come through.
Yeah,
Seriously.
I was getting lots of those comments on my videos too.
Oh, that's how I started to look at was my Jewish space laser video. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, well, yeah, so much to take apart with how Paradise burned. But when you drive around Paradise, one thing you don't see, there was, quite a few houses survived, but you don't see the ratty old shacks. And Paradise was poor, and there was a lot of old funky shacks and just piles of newspapers on the porch and ratty old tarps covering old piles of wood. And like, it was a target rich environment for fire. And so oftentimes, and the forest floor, there's pine needles and black oak. And so without the radiant heat, a lot of the fire that burned in Paradise was embers, land, catch pine needles on fire. Fire spreads slowly through pine needles and black oak, gets to a funky shack, catches the shack on fire. Radiant heat from the shack catches the house on fire. But the trees that were kind of outside the radiant heat effect of the burning structures, oftentimes there wasn't enough heat from the burning pine needles, or the trees weren't dense enough to carry a crown fire. So, but Paradise didn't really burn in like one big flaming front. It burned as like 10,000 small fires independently moving across the landscape.
I've always wondered what the explanation of that photo was, but that makes sense. It's almost like creeping along, gets to a house, pops up, then creeps along more, gets to the next one, pops up.
Yeah.
Whereas if
Yeah, there's this Landsat imagery that I kind of worked on, you might have seen, that shows a lot of the spotting and how the flaming front of the fire was all these different spots.
That's very interesting. So just going back to the like that northeast side of Mount Tam example, I imagine people living there probably wouldn't want to hear that it's a guarantee that their house is going to burn down. Is there anything that they can do, or like what would you tell someone who was living there and isn't willing to move?
I don't know if I'd tell them anything. I understand that like a lot of people can't just up and move, and that if you move, you might end up in a floodplain or somewhere else. I mean, there's natural hazards all around us, and it's kind of a price you pay for living in a beautiful place. Paradise was beautiful, and one of my coworkers, he knew the fire hazard was high, but he couldn't afford a house in Chico, like most people who lived in Paradise. It was a lot cheaper. He could buy a house. He bought a really nice 2-bedroom house on an acre for $105,000 in 2015, 105 grand. And so I'm not going to tell anyone anything except that just physics are physics. The limits are real to what we can do, and California grows vegetation really well. And so it's just kind of, to me, like it kind of just breaks down to, hard science, is that vegetation grows really fast. People can't really keep up with it. We've built our communities with poor layouts. And if you can't get insurance, or your insurance is going way up, it's because some really smart people have done the math and decided that the odds aren't good for you. So I know there's kind of, I don't really have a magic solution for people, except that they're living in fire's home. And so they need to, safety first, right? Like, don't get caught up in there. It's kind of a nightmare, to know this stuff and drive, like just driving around California. I mean, I've been on a couple hundred of the biggest fires in the state in the last 20 years, worked on almost all the big fires and seen a lot of burnt up places. And it's just really hard to drive around. And I feel like I got this kind of dark filter on, where I just look at places and I see them as, chimneys.
Yeah, just know there's too much fuels built up in that area.
And just so many people, and weather's hotter and drier, and there's wind, and I mean, it's just it's heavy. It's heavy stuff. And I think, to me, one of the interesting things really at this point, at this juncture we're at, is just the social science side of it, is how do we get through this together? And um but I think that a lot of times that there's not a real technical solution. You know, it's not like we're going to start a bunch of prescribed burn associations and burn our way out of the problem in Marin County. There's a lot of places that we're going to make great strides with it, and then there's other places that it's just not really feasible.
Mm-hmm.
And the workforce requirements are insane. So no simple solutions there. But I think recognizing that, like, where we're at in history, that people have been through a lot of traumatic things. You think of your grandparents, and it's like, I know my grandmother was a refugee from war in Europe, and my wife's mother was just here, and she was a refugee from war in Europe. And like this, I think the refugee term is an apt description of where we're at. Is that there's people who leave because their town was destroyed, and there's people who leave because their town is likely to be destroyed. You think of people pouring out of Ukraine before they had to, because they know bad things are happening. And that it's kind of where we're at with fire in California. And it's tough because there's never really a good place for refugees to go. Even, in Ukraine, it doesn't matter if you're wealthy. So getting through that all together, I think, just requires a lot of empathy and grace and community. Like, we've got to solve this problem together. But I think that we're not going to solve it with more air tankers and bulldozers. We're going to solve it by kind of getting radical and not rebuilding sticks, not really rebuilding these kind of wood frame houses in crazy tall brush. But when we talk about fire resistant construction, it's like just putting hardy backer on your stick frame house. That didn't cut it in Paradise. Half the houses rebuilt in Paradise, or half the houses built in Paradise with the modern building codes burned down in the campfire. So I think, we can build out of concrete, we can dig into the earth, but keeping on doing the same thing over and over is kind of,
Yeah, definition of insanity, right?
Right. Yeah. So I think we can get a lot more radical on the fire resistant construction. Like, it's going to be ugly, maybe. It's going to be different. But we kind of need to evolve a new architectural style. I like this idea of fire permeable communities, where you build a community where fire's coming, you close your shutters, go down to the basement, watch videos for a couple hours, whatever, and come out and mop up and then go back to work, because your house was built out of concrete and it didn't burn down, and your utilities are undergrounded. And it's like, we could be more radical in that way.
Yeah, I think I could definitely see that being a part of the solution. Refiguring out how we kind of design things, and then also I'd imagine the fuel aspect's probably going to be a big part of that as well.
It is. I think just that when it comes to vegetation management, like Paradise, it's one of the best places in the world to grow vegetation. Like huge trees, highly productive. And in some places it grows like many tons of vegetation per acre per year. And that's just relentless. That's just all is happening. And so I think we need to be realistic. And part of the problem in Paradise is that the town covers 15,000 acres. And so we've got this, fascination with low density residential. Everyone's got their half acre. But when it comes down to it, it's like, it makes for an unmanageable landscape. So, thinking of, and I mean, I don't want to live in a apartment complex or a 30-story building. But one of the problems in Paradise was just that the way a lot of the lots were laid out, you know, the lot might be so small that there's not room to get a chipper into the backyard.
Mhm.
And so if you have a whole bunch of people built along like a creekway or something, like it actually becomes physically impossible to like you end up having to haul like brush out through people's living rooms or something, you know.
So that
And
kind of reminds me of something I've been wondering. What do you think is the effectiveness of goats? Because I remember behind my parents' place, there's a
mhm.
bunch of goats came through, and they actually cleared out basically all the vegetation that was there. Like, could California just deploy an army of goats to solve our fuel problems?
Yeah, goats are great in the right fuel type, you know. uh, it's just that we have a lot of places where like goats don't like to eat dead manzanita, you know,
Mm.
they don't like to eat um, big gnarly oak branches and stuff. But yeah, that they're a big part of it. And I think, you know, part of that is like, let's eat more goat, right? Like artisanal goat loin or whatever. Like I was just talking to a woman from Spain, and in Spain they're like trying to encourage more grazing, and they're trying to build markets for things like sheep cheese and goat cheese, with the idea that you might buy that stuff and you might even pay more than you would otherwise, because you're subsidizing a local business that's increasing the fire resiliency of your community. So yeah, I think herbivory is part of it, but I think as a geographer, like a lot of it comes back to scale and understanding like the scope of the problem is that we've got 30 million people in a state, and a really high proportion of us live in places that have a fire hazard, and
Mm.
that the nature of the fire hazard is changing. And so it's like, well, are we going to graze goats in suburban Chico? Because that's where some of our fire problems are. You know, are we, you know, um, who's gonna run those goats? I mean, it even ties into like immigration. You know, like we need a workforce, we need a forestry workforce here of tens of thousands of people with chainsaws. Um, how does immigration policy affect that? You know, do we decide that we need, you know, 200,000 workers a year that we're going to let in from Central America because they're going to be the workforce that we need? Because we're running into workforce issues as it is with vegetation management in California.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I feel like a lot of the solutions that I hear about are kind of on like the society scale. Do you think the best way to address these problems is on like big societal solutions, or do you think it would be like each individual person taking care of their own land? And then if everybody does that, we'd be in a lot better place. Or is it kind of a balance
You
between
know, it
the
isn't working out. You know, the individual responsibility part isn't working out. Like we'd rather, like, I got weeds in my yard. I'd rather like come home and scroll on Instagram than like go out. It's 100 degrees outside. Like
two?
I don't
Yeah.
want to go out and like mow my weeds. Um, I think one of the problems I see as a person who's kind of a prescribed fire practitioner is that we've got this huge problem that was created by all of us, um, by building our towns in the wrong places, by not planning very well, by deciding we're going to put out all the fires. And then when it comes time to do something about it, like I'm working as a burn boss to help someone burn their place in Forest Ranch, and all that liability is on me, the individual. And there's very little incentive for me. I'm just doing it because I want to get experience burning, or I want to like be part of something positive happening. But um, but no one's really got my back. And if the fire gets away, I, the individual, am gonna either, you know, lose my license, or I'm gonna lose my house, or I'm gonna have to suffer personally knowing that I burned someone's house down. When it's a problem that we created as a society. So we need to socialize the risk of action, because otherwise there's really no incentive for people to want to be burn bosses. You know, we've got this enormous problem that we've created that makes it hazardous to put fire on the ground. Uh, but we have to accept we have to share the responsibility for dealing with it.
Yeah, I remember earlier you mentioned that California has a goal for burning, I think you said 1 million acres per year. And then I think you said something about kind of reduced litigation as well. Is there kind of a shift now that California is seeing what a big problem wildfire is to kind of reduce some of that liability? Or
There's progress being made on that. There is. Yeah.
Kind of, because as a society, it seems like people are gonna have to get more comfortable with prescribed burning, would you say?
Yeah.
Nice. Well, I have to start getting ready for the 11 o'clock news. It was great talking to you. Hopefully this isn't the last time we talk.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Oh yeah, and like I said, I'm new to the wildfire game, so it's great getting to talk with someone with decades of experience. So thanks again.
All right. Yeah. Keep up the good work. Glad to see you doing it.
All righty. It was great talking to you.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Bye.